Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be taking a look at something that's pretty fascinating to me, at least. We're going to be looking at agrarian society in Mughal India during the 16th and 17th centuries.
Oh yeah, it's a great topic.
I mean, just think about this for a sec, okay? 85% of the population at this time lived in villages. 85%, that's crazy, right? I mean, can you imagine what it would be like if today 85% of everyone in, like, America lived out in the countryside?
Yeah, no, it's dramatically different than our world today, but it also, means we have so many sources to draw on to kind of explore and unpack this world.
Yeah. So what kind of sources are we looking at here?
Well, we're looking at records from the Mughal court itself. We're also going to be taking a look at regional documents, and then, even looking at like the forests and trying to understand kind of life at the very edges of the empire.
Ooh, venturing out into the wilderness. Okay, so where do we even begin?
Well, maybe we should start with land.
Okay, land.
So, one thing that might be surprising to folks is that land ownership, it wasn't all about just these like massive estates. Even a relatively small plot of land could mean a lot.
Yeah, how small are we talking? Like, I would be considered like a big deal back then.
Well, like in Gujarat, if you had 6 acres, that was considered pretty affluent.
6 acres?
Yeah. But then in Bengal, it was like 10 acres, and you were called a rich Assami.
Okay, so those ideas we have in our head about like, big communal farms, that's not exactly accurate, huh?
No, not really. Individual land ownership was actually like a huge deal. It really shaped who had power and wealth out in the countryside.
So how did they work all this land then? Were they using like the same kind of plows and tools we use today?
No, 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 nothing like that. They were using pretty basic technology. Like imagine a wooden plow, just wood, but it has a metal tip like iron.
Okay.
And they would use oxen to pull these plows.
Oh, interesting. So did that work well in like the Indian climate?
Yeah, it was actually a really smart way to farm, especially when it was super hot out. They would use these shallow furrows, and that would help keep the moisture in the soil.
Okay, that's smart. And what kind of crops were they growing?
Oh my gosh, all kinds of things. Like in Abra, there's this one record that mentions 39 different types of crops.
39.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about growing enough to eat, just for themselves.
Right.
There were some crops that were considered like super important, like cotton and sugarcane. They called them jinzi kamil, which translates to like perfect crops.
Perfect crops. Why were those so special?
Well, they were really valuable. People could make a good living off of them, and the government got a lot of its money from taxing those crops.
Okay, so those perfect crops were kind of like the engine of the whole empire, huh?
Yeah, they were keeping things running for everyone, from the individual farmer up to the Mughal emperors. It's pretty amazing how it was all connected like that.
It really is. Okay, so we've talked about the land, the crops. What about the villages themselves? What was it like to live in a Mughal village?
Well, you might picture a village as just a bunch of farms and houses, right? But it was way more structured than that.
Okay, how so?
They had these councils called panchayats. And these were like groups of elders, mostly men, and they had a lot of authority. They could decide everything from, how to manage shared resources to resolving disputes. And I mean like serious disputes. We're not talking just like, who borrowed whose ox. They even enforced caste boundaries, like who could marry who and stuff.
Wow. So what happened if you like went against the panchayat?
Oh, there could be consequences for sure. You could have to pay fines or in some cases even get kicked out of the village.
Okay, that's serious stuff. So wait, there was more than one panchayat?
Yeah, each jati or caste had its own panchayat. It's pretty amazing how social and economic life were all tied together like that.
So everyone had to answer to somebody. What about the village headman?
Ah, yeah, the headman. They were called the mukadam or the mandal, depending on where you were.
Okay. So how was the headman chosen?
Well, the elders picked them, but then the zamindars, who were like the big landowners, had to approve it.
Okay, so they had some power, but they still had to answer to the zamindars.
Yeah, exactly. The headman was in charge of things like keeping track of the village accounts and making sure everyone was behaving themselves. But you can imagine, you give someone that much power, there's always a chance they might misuse it?
Yeah, and I'm sure that didn't always go over well with the villagers.
Oh, definitely not. It could cause a lot of tension and resentment. It's funny, right? We think of village life as being so peaceful and idyllic, but in reality, it was just as complex and messy as any other part of Mughal society. You had your elites, your power struggles, and everyone trying to figure out where they fit in.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't all sunshine and roses, huh? But it wasn't just farmers and village officials, right? There were also artisans in these villages, weren't there?
Oh, yeah, tons of artisans. They were a big part of the village, sometimes making up like a quarter of the population, even 25%. Think about all the different skills you needed to keep a village running. You had your potters, your blacksmiths, your carpenters.
Right, all essential jobs. So how do they fit into this whole system? Were they treated like, I don't know, second-class citizens?
Not at all. They were super important to the village economy. Sometimes they would barter their goods for food or other things they needed. Sometimes they would even get like little plots of land or a daily allowance from the village.
Interesting. So it wasn't just a strict hierarchy where everyone was stuck in their place. There was actually a lot of interdependence and exchange going on.
Absolutely. Everyone needed each other to make the village work. Okay, but we're forgetting someone.
Oh, yeah. We haven't even talked about the women yet. What were their roles in all of this?
It's easy to assume that women back then were just, stuck at home doing chores. But that couldn't be further from the truth. They were out there in the fields working alongside the men, sowing seeds, weeding, harvesting. And as agriculture became more and more about selling crops for profit, women's labor became even more important.
Really? So they weren't just like confined to the domestic sphere. They were really active participants in the whole agricultural system.
Oh, totally. And don't forget, they were skilled artisans too. Think about it, spinning yarn, preparing clay for pottery, doing embroidery, all sorts of things.
So wait, they were doing all that and working in the field? They must have been incredibly hardworking. I mean, if they were so vital to the village and the economy, did they have like a lot of social standing?
Well, that's where it gets a bit complicated. It was kind of a paradox, really. On the one hand, they were valued because they were the ones having babies, right?
Right.
And those babies grew up to be the next generation of workers. But even though they were essential, they were still under the control of men.
Ah, so they had all this responsibility and they were working so hard, but they still weren't really in charge of their own lives.
Yeah, pretty much. They were bound by all these social norms and traditions. But don't get me wrong, women weren't just sitting back and taking it. There are records of women petitioning village councils for justice, like if their husbands were mistreating them or neglecting their duties.
Wow. That's pretty brave considering the times.
It is, and there are even cases of women inheriting land and managing property. Some women even ended up in charge of huge estates, like big zamindaris.
Really? So they could actually wield some serious power in this system. That's pretty amazing.
It is. It just goes to show that even within a patriarchal society, women found ways to make their mark and have a say in their lives. So we've talked about life in the villages, but what about the folks who lived outside those boundaries, like in the forests?
Yeah, the vast majority of the population lived in villages, but there were still those who lived in the forests. What was life like for them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So these forests weren't just empty spaces, right? They were home to all sorts of communities. We called them tribal communities often. Back then they were called jungli.
Jungly? Is that like a negative term?
Yeah, it kind of is. It often meant like uncivilized or wild. But in reality, these communities were just as sophisticated as the folks living in villages.
Okay. So what was their way of life like?
They had their own ways of doing things, totally in tune with the seasons and the environment. They would use the forest for everything, food, medicine, building materials, you name it. And they would practice this type of farming called shifting agriculture.
Shifting agriculture, what's that?
It's where they would clear a patch of land, farm it for a few years, and then move on to a new patch, letting the old one regrow. It's actually a pretty sustainable way to farm in a forest environment. And even Babu, the first Mughal emperor, he actually talked about forests as places where people could go to get away from like state control, like maybe even hide out if they needed to.
Oh, wow. So even though the Mughal Empire was so huge and powerful, they didn't have complete control over everything?
Not entirely, no. These forest communities, they had a certain degree of autonomy, at least for a while. But that doesn't mean the Mughals weren't interested in them. They were really keen on getting elephants from the forests.
Elephants. What for?
Oh, elephants were super important for warfare and transportation and like just showing off how powerful you were.
Right, I guess elephants are pretty impressive.
Yeah. And they would also go on these big hunting expeditions into the forest, for sport, but also to kind of show their dominance over the land and the people who lived there.
I bet those expeditions weren't very popular with the forest communities.
No, probably not. Plus, the Moguls were constantly trying to expand agriculture, to make more money, so they started pushing into the forests more and more. And that created a demand for all kinds of forest products like honey and beeswax and gum lac, things like that. Some of those even became big exports.
So the forest communities were kind of caught in the middle of all this, weren't they? How did they deal with all these changes and pressures?
It wasn't easy, that's for sure. They had to adapt and find ways to survive. Some tribal chiefs actually ended up becoming zamindars themselves. Others formed their own armies or got involved in trade. And new ideas and cultural influences were spreading too, like Sufism. There were Sufi saints who helped spread Islam into these areas.
Wow, so even though they were far away from the Mughal court in the big cities, they were still affected by all these changes sweeping across the empire. Okay, so we've talked about the forest communities and the villages, but what about the zamindars? The big landowners we mentioned earlier. They must have had a lot of power in this whole system.
Oh, absolutely. They were like the key players in rural society. They had tons of land, what they called milkiyat, and they had their own armies, and they were the ones collecting taxes for the Mughal state. So, yeah, they were pretty much calling the shots in many places.
So they were like the middlemen between the Mughal emperors and the everyday people.
Exactly. They were the one who made sure the emperor got his taxes and kept things running smoothly in the countryside.
It sounds like a pretty sweet gig. I mean, they were basically landlords, right? Just collecting rent and living the good life.
Well, it was a bit more complicated than that. Yeah, they were collecting revenue, but they were also the ones who would often bring in new people to cultivate the land and give out loans. Think of them as powerful patrons who could offer protection and support to the people who worked for them.
Okay, so it wasn't just all about exploitation. They actually played a role in supporting the agricultural economy, too.
Exactly. And it's interesting because even the Bhakti saints, those religious figures who were super critical of social injustice, they didn't always see the zamindars as the bad guys. They actually reserved a lot of their criticism for state officials.
So it's not as simple as good guys and bad guys. The relationship between the zamindars and the peasants was a lot more nuanced than that.
Absolutely. It wasn't always perfect, but there was a certain level of reciprocity, and sometimes they even had to work together to push back against the state when things got out of hand. But to really understand how the Mughal Empire kept such a tight grip on this whole agrarian world, you have to look at their land revenue system. That was basically the lifeblood of the empire.
Yeah, taxes. Gotta love them.
Well, in this case, it wasn't just about grabbing whatever they could get. They had a super sophisticated system for managing it all. They had a whole bureaucracy dedicated to it. And at the top of that bureaucracy was the Diwan, the chief revenue official. His job was to make sure they measured all the land properly and figured out how much tax each person owed.
That sounds like a ton of work.
Oh, it was, and they were incredibly meticulous about it. They didn't just eyeball it. They had all these different categories for different types of land, like polage, which was land that was cultivated every year, and parati, which was land that was left fallow. And then they had all these complex calculations for figuring out how much tax each person should pay based on the type of land they had and the crops they were growing.
Wow, it sounds like they were really trying to get it right. Did they actually manage to keep track of all that?
Oh, yeah, they did. We even have records showing how they implemented these policies. Like in 1665, the Emperor Aurangzeb, he ordered that they should keep records of every single cultivator in every village every year. Can you imagine the paperwork?
That's crazy. It really shows how seriously they took this whole land revenue thing.
Oh, they did. It was the foundation of their power and wealth. And here's another mind-blowing thing. The global trade in silver actually played a huge role in all of this.
Silver. What does silver have to do with mobile taxes?
Well, think about it. India was producing all these amazing goods, cotton, spices, you name it, and the rest of the world wanted them. So all the silver was flowing into India to pay for those goods. And the Mughal state was able to collect a lot of its taxes in cash thanks to all that silver. It was like a global economic engine fueling the Mughal Empire.
That's amazing. I never would have guessed that something happening thousands of miles away could have such a direct impact on Mughal India. So how do we know all this stuff? I mean, how do we even piece together life was like back then?
Well, we have a lot of sources, but one of the most important ones is this incredible record from Akbar's court. It's this massive document that covers pretty much every aspect of the empire, from the army and administration to the revenue system and even cultural traditions.
Wow. Sounds like an encyclopedia of Mughal India.
Yeah, pretty much. It's like a gold mine for historians who are trying to understand how things worked back then. Especially for understanding the whole agrarian system. It's full of data and details about land ownership, crop yields, tax rates, all that stuff.
Okay, but surely there are some limitations to relying on just one source, right? Especially one that was written for the emperor.
You're absolutely right. We have to be careful not to take everything at face value. It definitely presents a view from the top, the emperor's perspective, and it focuses mostly on the areas around the capital, so it might not be entirely representative of what life was like in every corner of the empire.
Yeah, it's like looking at a puzzle where you only have a few pieces. You can kind of see the picture, but, there's a lot more to it.
Exactly. But even with those limitations, it's an incredible resource. It gives us so much insight into the Mughal Empire and the people who lived in it. It shows their ingenuity, their adaptability, and just how complex their social dynamics were.
So it's like a starting point, a way to get a glimpse into this fascinating world and then dig deeper to uncover more of the story.
Exactly, and there's so much more to discover. I mean, we haven't even touched on the impact of Mughal rule on these communities, the ways they resisted and adapted, and how this whole period shaped the India we know today. We'll have to save that for another deep dive. It really makes you think about all the different pieces that had to come together to make this whole empire work, you know?
Yeah, it's like trying to wrap your head around a puzzle with like a gazillion pieces.
Exactly. And remember how we were talking about how diverse Mughal India was? I mean, all those different cultures, languages, religions. It's kind of mind-blowing how they managed to keep it all together for so long.
Yeah, that's something I've always wondered about too. Like, how did they make it work? It wasn't just luck, right?
Oh, definitely not. They were smart about it. I mean, they were good administrators, for one thing. They also knew how to make strategic alliances, with different groups. And they were surprisingly tolerant of different religions, at least compared to other empires at the time.
Okay, so it was like a mix of different strategies, but this diversity wasn't just like some abstract thing, right? It was playing out in everyday life.
Absolutely. Remember how we were talking about those panchayats? Well, it wasn't like everyone on the panchayat was the same.
Yeah, right. You had different castes, different occupations, all coming together to make decisions.
Exactly. It was like a microcosm of the whole empire right there in the village. It makes you wonder, though, with all that diversity, was there anything that, like, held everyone together? Like, were there any common experiences that everyone shared?
That's a good question. It must have been hard to find common ground sometimes.
Well, there was one thing that everyone had in common, no matter who they were or where they lived: the monsoon.
The monsoon. Oh, right. The rainy season. Of course. I mean, if your whole livelihood depends on the crops growing, you'd definitely be paying attention to the weather.
Exactly. Everyone from the humblest peasant to the wealthiest zemindar, they were all at the mercy of the monsoon.
It must have been a pretty intense time, like waiting and wondering if the rains were going to come.
Oh, absolutely. It was a time of like hope and anxiety all mixed together. The monsoon was more than just weather, though. It was like woven into their culture. There were all these myths and stories and festivals connected to it.
Festivals. Like what kind of festivals?
Oh, all sorts of festivals: harvest festivals, religious festivals, all kinds of celebrations. They would have music, dancing, feasts. It was a time for the whole community to come together, to give thanks and celebrate and just enjoy themselves.
It's like the monsoon brought everyone together, not just physically, but also like culturally and spiritually.
Exactly. It was a reminder that everyone was connected to the land and to each other. Of course, it wasn't all festivals and happy times.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I mean, life was tough for a lot of people back then. I'm sure there was a lot of conflict and tension.
Oh, for sure. I mean, you have all these different groups competing for resources, trying to get ahead, and then you have the state, collecting taxes, imposing its authority. It was bound to create some friction.
Right. And peasants weren't just going to sit back and take it, were they?
No way. They found ways to push back, to make their voices heard.
Like how?
Well, remember those petitions we talked about? Women going to the village council to complain about their husbands, things like that. That was a form of resistance. And peasants would often challenge the tax collectors or refuse to pay if they thought it was unfair.
It's kind of inspiring, actually, to think of these ordinary people standing up for themselves, even though they were up against such powerful forces.
It is. It shows that they weren't just passive victims. They had agency, they had a sense of justice, and they were willing to fight for what they believed in.
And sometimes they would take it even further, right? Like actually rebelling against the authorities.
Oh yeah, sometimes things would boil over and you'd have full-blown rebellions. Peasants would abandon their villages, refuse to pay taxes, even take up arms against the state or the zamindars.
Wow, that's pretty intense. I guess when people get pushed too far, they're going to push back no matter who they are.
Exactly. These rebellions, they're a reminder that power was never absolute in Mughal India. There was always this undercurrent of resistance. People were constantly testing the limits, pushing the boundaries.
It's like this constant back and forth, this negotiation of power between those in charge and those who weren't.
Exactly. And those stories of resistance, they're just as important as the stories of the emperors and the battles. They give us a much more complete picture of what life was really like back then. They show us the human side of history, the struggles and the triumphs of everyday people.
So it's not just about the big picture. It's about the little details, the individual stories that make up the bigger narrative.
Exactly. And when you start to look at those individual stories, you realize that Mughal India wasn't just this monolithic empire. It was this incredibly dynamic and complex society, constantly changing and evolving. It was shaped by all these different forces: economic forces, social forces, cultural forces, and of course the power of the land itself.
And all those forces, they didn't just disappear, did they? they've continued to shape India right up to the present day.
Absolutely. The legacy of the Mughal Empire is still visible everywhere you look, from the way land is owned and farmed to the amazing cultural diversity that makes India so unique.
It's amazing to think that something that happened hundreds of years ago can still have such a profound impact on the world today.
It is. It shows that history isn't just something that happened in the past, you know? It's still alive and well, shaping our present and our future.
And speaking of the future, I think it's time to move on to the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, exploring the villages, the forests, the power dynamics, the challenges, and the triumphs.
It's been quite a journey, and in this last part, I think we should try to connect all those threads together and see how the legacy of Mughal India continues to inspire and inform us today. It's amazing, isn't it, how we can look back at these records and almost feel like we're right there with them, seeing the world through their eyes.
Yeah, it's not just about kings and queens and battles. It's about understanding how people lived their lives, what they cared about, what they struggled with.
Right. And as we've been talking about all these different aspects of agrarian society in Mughal India, I keep thinking about something.
Oh, what's up?
Well, how did all these structures, these hierarchies and systems, how did they actually shape the way people thought about themselves? Like their identity and what they hoped for in life.
That's a really interesting question. Yeah, we've been talking about the big picture, the whole empire, but it all comes down to individual people in the end, right? How did all this affect them on a personal level?
Exactly. So imagine for a second, okay, you're a peasant living in a Mughal village. Your whole life revolves around the land, the seasons, the monsoon. Your caste determines your place in society. And your interactions with the zamindar or maybe some state official, they can literally make or break you.
It sounds like there's a lot of prayer, a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, definitely. So how do you, as a person living in that world, how do you make sense of it all? Do you just accept things the way they are? Or do you try to push back, try to change things? Do you find comfort in your religious beliefs? Or maybe in your community, the people around you?
It's fascinating to think about all the choices people had to make back then.
And all those choices, all those little acts of survival and resilience, they shaped who they were and what they wanted out of life.
So it's not just about what happened, it's about how people responded to what happened, right?
Right. It reminds us that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about people. Real people making real choices, just trying to live their lives the best they could.
And speaking of people making choices, we can't forget about all those amazing cultural traditions that emerged during this period, like the Bhakti movement, for example. It was all about personal devotion and challenging social inequalities.
Yeah, the Bhakti movement was huge. Imagine hearing those songs, those poems, echoing through the villages, carrying messages of hope and equality.
Yeah, it must have been really powerful.
It was, and it wasn't just about entertainment. It was a way for people to express their faith, to find comfort and strength in a world that could be pretty harsh sometimes.
It was like a way to connect with something bigger than themselves, right? Something that transcended all the divisions and difficulties of everyday life.
Exactly. And those songs, those stories of saints and miracles, they gave people something to believe in, something to hope for.
It's really amazing how culture can bring people together like that.
Yeah. It reminds us that even when things are tough, even when there's conflict and division, people still find ways to create beauty and meaning and connection.
And in a place as diverse as Mughal India, that connection must have been super important.
Absolutely. It was a way to bridge those differences, to find common ground between all those different groups and communities.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating world, what do you think are some of the key takeaways? What can we learn from all this?
Well, I think one of the biggest lessons is that Mughal India wasn't this static, unchanging thing. It was a dynamic society full of all these different forces pushing and pulling, changing and adapting. And I think it reminds us that history is never simple. There are always multiple perspectives, multiple stories, and it's up to us to try to piece them all together.
Yeah, it's like a giant puzzle, right? And every piece is important.
Exactly. And I think another important takeaway is the power of resilience. We've seen how people found ways to adapt to changing circumstances, to resist oppression, to create something beautiful and meaningful out of hardship.
And those stories of resilience, they're not just relevant to the past, are they? They can inspire us today, too, to face our own challenges with courage and creativity.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that no matter what obstacles we face, the human spirit is capable of amazing things.
Well, it's been an incredible journey exploring this world with you. We've gone from the fields to the forests, from the villages to the palaces, and we've seen how all these different pieces fit together.
It's been a lot of fun, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed it too.
I'm sure they have. And I hope they'll continue to explore this fascinating period in history on their own. There's always more to discover, more stories to uncover, more connections to make.
That's right. Keep digging, keep questioning, keep learning.
That's what history's all about. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time, keep exploring.